Hey, this is Ross Richie. I'm the founder and chief executive officer of Boom Studios. And you know Boom because we do Something is Killing the Children. And my esteemed guest today, Once and Future, Kieron Gillen, who writes Once and Future. We also do We Only Find Them When They're Dead, and Seven Secrets, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. So this is the second part of my interview with Kieron Gillen, who you would know as the creator of Phonogram from Image, along with The Wicked and the Divine, as well as Die, three smash hit series from Image. He also did Once and Future for Boom. He wrote Kid Loki and Journey into Mystery, one of my favorites, as well as Young Avengers and Uncanny X-Men for Marvel. He's one of the hottest writers in the business. This is part two of the interview. We do a lot of conversation about breaking in, and he has a lot of really fascinating stories about how he became obsessed with comics and broke in. He did it in a really unorthodox way, but I think there's a lot of great tips and great wisdom that you can take from this interview. So without any further ado, here you go.
Okay, so damn, you're paying for school, writing, doing journalism, and so that makes it. So talk about that hinge point of science. So Denver is really the moment where you're just like, stuff this, I'm out. There's no way. You're kind of isolated, and
Yeah.
but and are you writing for Amiga then?
No, Amiga Power's closed down that summer.
Okay.
Like the magazine, like the Amiga was towards the end of its life cycle.
Okay.
I was writing under a pseudonym. I wrote solely a lot of like all my fanzines had pseudonyms always.
Wow.
So I killed off my pseudonym from Amiga Power, Sea Monster, as in C, short for cookie. I killed that off on the dance floor of Fusion whilst dancing to Everything Must Go. Tears down my face. I was very melodramatic.
Wow.
And the thing about America, the interesting thing actually was it was probably the first year I went native on the internet. As in, since I was quite isolated where I lived, like I set up websites. I ran a band called Kaniki, who I wrote a lot about. I ran their biggest website, Kaniki Fried Chicken, which was a lot of fun. And I wrote a lot. And that's one of the, I think that, and also I was playing online role-playing games like text-based, like Mushes I was playing back then. And this is such a weird year, as it's the year that I first got my RSI. But it's the first year that I was typing a lot. And my ability to just generate words, I think, had become something else in that period. So when I came to my final year and trying to, okay, I need to work out a way to eat. I graduated. I started I worked bars. I stayed in Bath because the idea of going back to Stafford felt like death.
Yeah.
I was very aware that it was like, if I can afford to live here, I should carry on.
Yep.
And I applied for jobs. I was writing fanzines. I was in this band. I did actually realize the band wasn't going to go anywhere quite quickly. It was the moment when I realized everyone wasn't as committed as I was to the band. I was also terrible.
That's tough. Yeah.
It was not, it was one of those moments when I realized I cannot rely on anyone else here. I'm just going to go all in on writing. And of course, the irony is, after like another 6 or 7 years, I go back to comics and suddenly I'm in a collaborative medium again. So I must love working with people. You know what I mean? There's something I really like that. But then I went hard into writing, wrote these zines. I was applying for jobs. I got an interview at the NME, didn't get it, which is, it was a job I was desperately underqualified for. And I wrote this sort of covering letter that I sort of knew that if they were hiring someone who they wanted qualified, they would never hire me. So I wrote this incredibly elaborate piece of art covering letter about, but I remember the line, because somebody has to exploit me. And they got me.
I love it. But let's unpack for a second, because NME, New Music Express, is everything. Like this era especially, and then on top of it in the music press, and like my perception from this era is like Rolling Stone says X, Y, and Z, that's a big deal. But NME says something, it's much more powerful, and it's much more cultivated and specific, and you know, and so that's a moment, because that's like a top of the mountain, right? You know,
Yeah.
and
I
to
mean,
apply and not to get in. I mean, that's sort of like almost, if you look back on your career, that's almost like a near miss. You would have been in a completely different world.
there was the real. Sorry. Yes, right. There was the set. I knew I would not going to be. The second I knew I would not be hired for that job, I asked what the wage was in the interview, and they told me the wage, and it was like, "All right, I'm not going to get this job." You know, this is my first job out of university. This wage is like kind of like too high for me.
Yep.
But like, I ended up like applying. I got a job at PC Gamer then. However, if you skip forward a few years,
yep.
I actually covered. I win a competition for the enemy. I wrote. This is an awful story. I wrote this entry for this competition, waking up in bed with this girl I met from a club, just to show off. Like an, you know, this is the age of. I'm an all. Like, why would I think that would impress her? Why would I think that?
Right.
And I write it, and I win this competition. And of course, I apparently didn't write my email. I didn't write my contacts correctly, so they had to actually phone around to work out who I was.
Oh.
So they eventually say, "Do you want to cover? You know, we would like you to cover the Reading Festival." So I cover the Reading Festival for the NME.
Oh my God.
I do it for their website. It's fun. Like, it's really hard work. I'm petrified because obviously this is something I've worked for years to want to be good enough.
Yes.
And I do it, and across the weekend on Sunday night, the editor of the website said, "You've done really well this weekend. Like, obviously you're based in Bristol, but like, get in contact with this person. You know, there's gig reviews in Bristol, etc. You know, you're definitely someone we'd like to work with again." And I walked away like I was flying. There's few times I've been as happy in my life. I went to see the Flaming Lips that evening at the Reading Festival.
Wow.
It was like, you know, it's Flaming Lips circa Soft Bulletin. It's incredibly poetic and beautiful. I go back, crash out delighted, wake up the morning after and I go, I don't want to work for the enemy. It's literally that, because the enemy is a great paper. It's the big brand. But the magazine I loved was the Melody Maker. And the Melody Maker was the kind of scrappier, messier cousin, and like a bit more personality led. And then and that had just crashed down and no longer existed. So it's explicitly, it was that moment I realized, oh, I've achieved what I wanted to achieve. Oh, I don't want this, do I? And that's, and of course, I was also really enjoying the games writing by then so much. I sort of fell away from games at university, and because mainly time, and found much more into music. And when I got the job at PC Gamer, that was like an uptick. So I ended up becoming really into the game culture again, obviously being embedded in it every single day.
Which PC Gamer is gigantic. I mean, it's incredible, you know, sort of like these moves that you're pulling off. Are just huge. Anyway, sorry.
No, absolutely. I ended up being deputy. I mean, they're two separate magazines. Actually, the UK magazine was the first one. And then the actual American one was the spin-off. But I eventually got to deputy editor on PC Gamer before leaving. I was there for like 4.5 years, 5 years.
Wow.
And I said that the British magazine is very personality led. I was moderately. It's very difficult to talk about my previous career as a games journalist, as in I was definitely. I mean, star writer might be a good way of putting it. I was the kind of, I got a lot of fan mail as a games writer because my stuff was very personality led. And it was because my trick as a games writer was I was lifting techniques from the music press and using them in the games press. And games people hadn't quite seen that before. So they were being, you know, I was slightly pretentious, but I was also quite funny. I hope anyway. I mean, I had a voice anyway.
Well, so let's pause here for a second, because that's another thing that I think is worth sort of unpacking. And like one of the best examples of this for me is, you know, when Frank Miller goes and does Sin City, and, you know, Frank's evolution of his drawing technique was a huge departure. So visually, it was incredibly powerful. But the story material that Frank delivered was very much in a conventional detective fiction, which is I'm not saying that's negative, but it was within a very familiar framework for a detective story. Now he made it more dark and more violent, and more sexual, but it was a good example of Frank loved this thing over here, which was detective fiction. it was not really being done in comics at all. He delivers it with this new skin, and it explodes. And minds are blown. They've never seen anything like it before. But it's like, I think a lot of creative power comes from, mashup is too glib a term, and I think it has other connotations. It's like this notion of, you see it with Neil with Sandman, where he's going and taking the kind of books and literature that he enjoyed, certainly a good dollop of Clive Barker, which was in comics at the time, but he's putting it together in this very unusual way that then gets a lot of attention. And he had the courage to sort of dismiss the earlier incarnations of the character. I mean, DC was encouraging creators to do that, so it was very supported, if not advocated for. But sort of being able to feel the departure and the freedom from being able to go, the 40s version of the character I'm gonna walk away from, and I'm gonna go in a completely different direction. And so just that idea of, what are your strengths? What are the things that you love, that you're particularly good at, have a passion for, and then figuring out a way to express them in a different arena is a great way to differentiate yourself. And I'm talking about Titans with Neil Gaiman and Frank Miller, that had a huge career and tremendous accomplishments, but these are big moments that really take their career to the next level. And by the way, worth mentioning, Neil also navigated the journalism to comics route as well. So sorry, back. I'll stop with my interjecting. So
no. I think what you're doing is actually pulling out really important things in terms of people's journeys. I mean, like me and Jamie talk about this all the time, but comics for us are not best, but like some of the best stuff in comics are basically, because it's a bastard medium.
Yep.
The fact when it's insular and looking at it what it's already done, it's at its worst, or like at least interesting for me. And it's like all the great stuff in comics are based around creators looking at the world and taking something from outside. Like,
yes,
feels like you don't get, if you don't really get Eisner if you take away Eisner's theatre influence, for example.
Absolutely.
If you take away Pynchon, you don't get Alan Moore. And these aren't the fact they're derivative. And also, moving stuff to another medium is by definition transformative. I mean, when we get, obviously, me and Jane with Phonogram, we're trying to do a music comic in a medium with no sound. And like, we always knew that the job was impossible. But like, okay, let's think about how can we possibly try to do this? And that impossible gap led to whatever we try to create. And this is always kind of what's...
I'm sorry, at that moment with Phonogram, is it a formalist sort of like, did you approach it with a perspective on the formalism of demonstrating music in comics? And if you did, where did you get that vantage point from to be able to approach it with that level of sophistication?
It's one of these things like I'm going to zoom slightly for the game. I'm actually take this to the zoom. I'm going to zoom for the game stuff briefly, because basically on PC Gamer I went freelance. I stayed freelance from 2003 to I officially retired from game journalism in 2010 when I became even more infamous in this period. I wrote a manifesto that it's still talked about in academic circles. I caused all manner of trouble.
Well, I got to know about the manifesto. Come on. Help.
It's called the Google New Games Journalism. I basically was ripping off like Tom Wolfe and talking about travel journalism to imaginary places. And this was like a big deal and people fought on the internet. It was a lot of fun. And in 2007, me and my Jim Rosignol, who was ex-PC Gamer, also the current co-writer of Ludocrats, we launched with Alec Meir and John Walker, we launched a site called Rock Paper Shotgun, which is like one of the major PC game sites now. So we launched that in 2007. I left when it was formed. All the way that I fell in love with comics around. I got back into comics that year I lived in America. As you say, it's funny, I didn't even mention that. That's the year, as I was waiting for my American visa, I picked up Watchmen from a shop in Oxford Street in London and read it from cover to cover whilst waiting for my visa.
Wow.
Then I went to America, lived there, and in my flat I was staying with no TV. So I was trapped in this room for a week, until I had any form of entertainment. And I basically just read Watchmen again and again and again because I had no access to anything else. And that's when, and this, of course, so I even from right in the beginning, I was very interested in Watchmen as a piece of art, as a formalist statement. So this is kind of comics are interesting. And I didn't really get fully into comics circa 2000.
Yep.
When Alan Moore was doing the ABC books, and that was enough.
Wow.
I heard from a friend about like I thought, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, that sounds interesting. So I started going to actual comic shops.
Wow.
That led me to a lot of. This led me to a bunch of stuff. Eventually to the Warren Ellis's books, the Warren Ellis Forum, and then the Comics Internet. And so I went rapidly from somebody who didn't know anything about comics to my first Comic Con, and I wrote my first Comic Con. Sorry, my first Comic Con was like 6 months after I got into this stuff. Wow. And I wrote my first script that night when I came home drunk. It wasn't polished or anything, but I wrote the basics. But
That's
sort of like I
amazing.
came in late. I came in as an adult, and I came with somebody who's interested in formalism. As in, and I specifically, I was interested in writing comics because what can comics do?
Wow.
And so we do all my early work. We do bits of early. So I'm doing lots of stuff in the British small press, web comics, all manner of like.
Can you talk about that for a second? Because I think that.
Cool. No.
We don't have to.
This is also detailed, as in like. And so I'm remembering we're heading towards music and comics. This is our journey here.
Yep.
My earliest work were like. I remember writing this book. I wrote that short story I mentioned, Hit. It was called Hit.
Yep.
And this little 5-page comic, Can I Write a Comic? And it's basically 9-panel grid about a guy being hit by a car. And as his head is hitting the floor, he's losing each part of his sensory brain. So the narrative changes, so you lose different parts of consciousness. So it's like, I say it's experimental. It's not very experimental, but what it is it's how can I tell this sort of story in comics? And in 5 pages and do it like this.
I think that's very experimental. I mean, I'm presuming, let me interject, I apologize, but it's like, have you read Understanding Comics at this point?
Yes. Oh, that's what I'm mentioning. Understanding Comics was like, the other thing was living in America, that Watchmen thing, the role-playing people I hung out with, one of them was a big comics guy. And he lent me long boxes of Vertigo stuff. And he actually bought me Understanding Comics as a present, I think.
Wow.
And that's kind of like, you know what I mean? That was one of my kind of, since it was a year when I had very little social life, it was like all manner of stuff I went through. But it's like, I always remember like the Hellblazer, the Invisibles, Preacher. And of course, when I came back, when I came out of the year, I was like I was now like a 1 or 2 trade a year guy. You know, that kind of person who buys 1 album a year. I was that person. And it was whatever Preacher trade, whatever Invisibles trade. But I was aware that, comics are something which are interesting. I remember like working bars, and I actually did working on this 9-panel grid idea on a beer mat, that kind of, so it was in my head. I was comics curious.
I wonder if it's interesting because your interest in music with sort of, so between Watchmen being so gigantic and the 9-panel grid, which is so distinctive, and in particular the way that time is used, and sort of there's so much formalism with how the camera moves forward or to the side, or like there's a whole, I know my alma mater, University of Texas, used to teach Watchmen, but there's a lot to it. On top of that, then you have that deconstructed for you in Understanding Comics, so it gives you a more sort of clear vocabulary for that. And I think about, there is so much formalism in music, and it's there from inception. Like the minute that you as a kid can hear the bass line and you realize there's a bass line, or even more superficially when you realize there's drums, because that's kind of one of the first musical experiences that people have, right? And so to me, it's like being able to separate these things out in different particulate parts, that's a key to music, and especially to writing about music. And then you're encountering, one of the most formal, on a formalist basis, one of the most sophisticated pieces. And then you're getting Understanding Comics, which can make you break that down and sort of take your analytical mind to what is intuitively so powerful and kind of give you that vocabulary. Sorry, that's feels nuclear.
Absolutely. It's like this is, I came to comics with the critic, especially because I was, I talk about being a reviewer and whatever. I was a critic. In like, I always remember my favorite, some of my favorite compliments or insults. I remember this one kid on a forum saying, "Oh, Kieron Gillen, he's that reviewer who writes like he's a critic." Ugh, critics. And I'm like, I'll take it.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a point of view.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, this follows all the way from my comics, as in I used to I think I'm better at it now, but there is a certain like intellectual coldness to some of the stuff I do. Like because the fact I don't do stuff by accident. You know, I think
more
things
analytical.
through. You know, I am that person who bringing a tool set, and I'm often, even my stories are structured like arguments. Like I do thesis, counter thesis, synthesis. You know, I'm very explicitly. I mean, phonogram is basically music journalism in the form of a fantasy story. Like that, all you get all these arguments. These arguments all seem kind of convincing, but they are all false. And eventually, the story will come to the story itself, but how everything integrates will express how I really feel without ever actually stating it. So those sort of skill sets that I think like a critic is always there, and I can't really avoid it, which I quite, you know, I wouldn't want to avoid it because as we said earlier, your voice is you. You know, it's that kind of you definitely hit an age when you realize, not even an age, it doesn't really matter who dislikes you as long as enough people like you, because we live in a medium where, you know, if 10,000 people love what you do and the rest of the human race despise you, you can eat. If the whole human race kind of likes you and no one's willing to pay for you, you can't eat.
Yeah.
You know, there's a kind of like, there's the awfulness of when you want to be an artist, when you want to be a work, when you want to live from your art is a better way of putting it. That's a tricky thing to say. So this is also skipping ahead a bit, but like when I got to the point doing Phonogram, I was working with something else at the time. This kind of like much more generic comic. It was like it was a supernatural SAS sort of comic. You know, everyone's got one of them, and we'd actually been accepted from a publisher, being this artist, and it was fun and it was political, and I liked it. And there's still some good ideas in it. But actually, it was Alex DeCampi, who said, "Are you sure you want this to be your first comic?"
Wow.
And which is cruel, but they like, and it did make me go, "Well, yeah, she's right." And then I threw everything into Phonogram in that kind of like, Phonogram is such a very, Phonogram would not, no one would think Phonogram's a good idea except for possibly me, maybe Jamie. I'm not sure about Jamie. But you know what I mean? As in, like, Phonogram is very clearly a big burst of somebody who has something to say in comics. It doesn't matter if it's any good or not. It's that kind of like, you know,
right.
You know, like
we want voice.
Something I often say about Phonogram is, I don't know if it's good, but I know it's clever.
Well, I can allay that suspicion. It is good.
You're very
All right,
kind.
so let's rewind. Where were we in the progression?
So let's pick up from like doing these hits. So the idea of that first strip was, can I do something which holds together an aesthetic? Right. And then, okay, can I get someone to draw the bloody thing? So I show it to Anthony Johnston, the writer, who's also at Future Publishing, where I work at PC Gamer.
Wow.
He says, yes, it's pretty good. He says, and then I use his recommendation to put an advert on one of the forums. And an artist picks up who said, "Oh, I'll draw it for you." Then we stick it on.
Okay. So now this is a situation that so many people find themselves in. And I think so many aspiring writers find themselves in. And you know, for context, Anthony Johnston, you should look him up, has a raft of credits. And you know, there's a Charlize Theron film that was just released based on one of his graphic novels. So very established writer, I think, even at that time, right?
He was in like.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I forget how many credits he had, but he had enough. You know, he was working. He was doing work.
He was working. And here he gives you sort of like the direction of like, go onto the web to a specific community where artists are looking for writers. Yeah. And this is information I'm constantly giving on Instagram, which is, hey, you know, you are a writer and you don't know an artist. The internet is your tool. So go find, there's community around creating comics in various different places, and go and, you know, part of the gig here is being able to talk to somebody about what you want to do. It's being able to figure out, you know, it goes back to your social thesis of figuring out how to collaborate and create a relationship with the artist. And you're going to have to woo and work with them to get them, because at that point you're both aspirant and there's no money yet.
Yeah, right? I mean, it's like I'm always quite careful about this because I'm very aware of the actual specific social networks change over time. Like
Yes.
And also in the period I was in, these were forums were the main way people talked.
Right.
So I was part of these forums. There was a community of people there. I wasn't a stranger. At the same time, when I put an advert up, I tried, because some people just go, "Want new artists?" And I wrote. Actually, I did a full advert. I started with a line of dialogue from the comic, but I did the kind of I said Anthony Johnson says this, etc. 5 pages. So I took it like I made a little bit of effort to sell it. Like I've always been. I must say that part of the job I've always been okay at. And then of course when Brian like came from Florence, I can't remember his surname. Sorry, it's so long ago. Brian, he drew it. We published it on Next Comics. People liked it, and when it was online, people saw it. Like other people said, "Hey, we should do a comic sometime."
Wow.
And that kind of, by doing the one work, it shows up. So I basically ended up doing a series of other 5-page comics, all called Hit. And each one of these comics were based on a different definition of the word hit. And of course, this is basically an intellectual exercise. This is about also me learning to draw comics. Each one of these things were kind of like, okay, can this technique work? Can, what sort of genre can you do here? What's kind of, also, what does this artist do? Because they're all different artists. So
break that down. Spend some time on that for a minute of like, when you say that, for people that are not sort of thinking in this dimension, when you assess those, it doesn't have to be those artists specifically, but maybe you can go through and talk a little bit about like when you're looking at an artist that you're going to collaborate with, sort of recognizing strengths and weaknesses.
It's true. I mean, this is some of the bits where I think people don't talk about this enough in writing guides, and I think it's quite hard to talk about, because you can only really talk about strengths of artists in public. Because if you talk about weaknesses, the artist will kill you and you'll never work with them. But you know what I mean? But at the same time, it's the job. Like you kind of look at the artist, think, okay, what can they do, and what are they good at? I mean, there's a regular error I see in like indie, especially like hard indie work, as in like real like just breaking in. The writers clearly learned to write by reading mainstream action comics. And they're using 5-panel pacing, they're using splash pages, which are all really good, strong techniques. And they're artists who quite often a splash page requires a certain level of competence to get impact. If you're asking someone to do like throw a punch and that person's not very good at throwing punches, it's just not going to be meaningful. So like the job would be, okay, and maybe it'd be better if I want to actually show violence, maybe I'll be better doing a 10-panel page and really break it down to individual, that kind of like, what is the hard limit? And because so if the artist looks good, you look good. And some of the very best writers in the industry, I mean, look at Alan Moore. I think Alan Moore has got amazing work out of every single artist he's ever worked with. And obviously Alan's got a very unique way of working, but like across the board, incredible work is resulting.
I think that comes from him being an artist.
That also,
I mean, people don't recognize that Alan would have been a credible comic book artist in his own right.
I mean, it's hard for someone like me who has very little actually, I think it's more patience. Like, weirdly, I actually did do some comics when I was a teenager for like my local scout group, and they were like 2-panel cartoons, terrible doodles. But I did actually, as well as like working with artists, and I did like I said webcomics and other stuff, and as well as the journalism which got my name around. I did a webcomic called Negative Land. Negative Land was basically a photo comic, but as the name suggests, all the images are flipped. I sort of realized that I'm not going to get my friends to pose regularly to do this comic. That no one likes me that much. So the actual exercise is I'm going to basically take the camera out with me, and I'm going to take photos of as we're clubbing or doing social stuff. And then when the 2 weeks are over, I'm going to look at what photos I've got and work out what story I can tell with them.
Wow.
By editing them or cutting or like whatever like narrative like captioning technique. And I had there was a story to tie it together. The story was called it was set in something called The Village, maybe. The idea was a reality TV show. This is just after Big Brother, so it's quite early reality TV shows. So it's like 500 people are stuck in a fake village with cameras, and they're all basically trapped there, and eventually one person will win, is the idea. And of course, spoilers, the story's not very good. They're all robots, and it's all a test. And that's the kind of setup. But it's basically my kind of, because I was living in Bath at the time, which is a small town, quite incestuous. So I was kind of wanting to let's do a story about an incestuous social scene.
But let me,
it's not very good, definitely. But at the same time, it's like every 2 weeks I did like a 5 to 13 page story of what I could do. And it's like literally sitting down and go, okay, this is the story I want to tell. These are the images I have. I know all I've learned in comics. How can these techniques come together and do something? And there's definitely like, I think there's like about 300 pages of it.
Wow.
If you go through it all, you'll see like, yeah, that's bad. That's clearly put together wrongly. But you still say, okay, that's an effective page, or that's a bit where he's got something. Because the other thing about this period you can see is, since as you say, I come from a formalist background, the comics I was writing, you can sort of tell what has Kieron read the week before. Like, you know what I mean? This is the comic. This is very clearly the comic Kieron's just read Luther Arkwright.
Right.
This is very clearly the comic Kieron's just read Cerebus.
Yeah.
You know, because I've suddenly become, not that I'm doing stories in their style, but I'm aware that, oh, panels can do this.
Right. Well, that's, I think that there's a lot that needs to be said about that, because it's like, there's one thing to read Understanding Comics and start to look at comics formally, and then just continue to read comics and aspire to write. And it's something completely different to do the work, and you're doing the work in a safe venue where it isn't life or death publishing. You know, you're not in a place where if this doesn't work, and if they see that you're too derivative of Luther Arkwright, your career's over. And I think there's a lot to be said for the small stage when you're starting off, because you can make your mistakes and you can bury them and no one will see them. And a lot of virtue to that.
Yeah, and especially like when I talk about Negative Land, it's like I approached it seriously. I also knew it wasn't good. I knew it would never be published. But I also knew that this was it was like going to the gym, you know, like and I've lost what I was going to say.
Well, it's that notion of doing the work. I always reference, it's the 10,000 hours Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know that Malcolm coined it, but that he certainly popularized it. But that sort of the 8 years of work that you need to do to be able to get good at anything. And it's intimidating when you're starting out to hear that, you know, it's going to take 8 years before you get good at it. But I think it's sort of, if you have not done the work, it's hard to understand that it's joyous and it's not work. And if it's what you're supposed to do, which is what your talent is, what your skill is, what you're good at, it doesn't feel like work. And so, you know, you find yourself in a place, I mean, you've got to hone and think critically and assess and get better. But at the same time, it's the thing that you're looking forward to while whatever your day job is.
It's one of those, I remember what I was going to say. You said earlier about writing for bad artists, or like artist limitations. The joy of that photo comic was I was writing for a very bad artist. You know, I was writing for an artist who like he's only got some pictures he's drawn.
Right.
How can you make a story? You know what I mean? Like, and I think that's as an exercise to learn. Is like, I mean, I actually did collage comics before then as well.
Yeah.
And it's like the thing is, there's definitely some writers who want them, and I don't mean this as any shade, but some people who get into comics because they want to write a very certain kind of story. Maybe they're not even interested in comics per se. They're interested. They want to write the continuing adventures of, say, Spider-Man. You know, and love to them. But for me, it was always I was interested in what comics could do, and therefore my interest could scale down to the fact that I'm going to do a story entirely based around cutout pictures of robots from a comic or something. You know what I mean? And because that is something that I could do in my own power, rather than wait for permission from somebody else. And those lessons are transferable. You know, the idea that I know how a pause panel can work in Negative Land. These are things which you can scale up from one lesson, so one form to another. And as you say, these are ways to practice. And that kind of there is the joy. I mean, apart from the time, because time is definitely an asset people don't have. But if you would genuinely have time, the ability to do comics by yourself in some form, I mean, that's the job. If I was saying, you know, you talk about like, I mean, everyone's mocking Adobe's software on, you know, the make your own comics sort of stuff. Right. I was looking at that thinking, you know, if I was like literally just trying to do comics in my bedroom in 2003, I would have had fun with that. You know, yes, it would not have been good. It would not have been like professional level. I would have been able to find a way to think about comics. That's the sort of, and this also, if I dial back to my fanzine background, like, so much of the culture I came from was the idea of appreciating an art form also often involved doing it. Like
Yes.
Riot Girl, like for example, Riot Girl, there's that zine culture. Everyone did zines and wrote about their feelings and music, but they often formed bands as well.
Yep.
And the point of appreciating something was also partly doing something. Not,
Yeah.
I mean, this is always the thing about me breaking into comics. I think I might be in denial. I don't remember actively wanting to break into comics.
Wow.
That's, you know what I mean? That's weird. Like,
Yes.
and I clearly must have because I was driven, but it was always about, I mean, being paid for it was almost a side product of doing it.
Well, that's a good sign, because you hear people saying things of like, I do this for free, and that's that shows the love for it. But the other thing I want to point out to the audience is a focus and a dedication, and I think that those things are critical. And I think on the other side of the desk, from the working professional mode, as people come in to break in, most professionals have this same story, which is tremendous focus, tremendous dedication, appreciation for the craft. And when people feel like they can just walk up and apply and be accepted, there's a lot of the professionals that are like, well, wait a minute, I've really spent, because I think buried in the story that you're telling is a really productive use of your 20s.
I look back, I'm not sure about that. There's a little bit clubbing.
But for the guy that music is incredibly informative of your approach to creativity, and sort of the notion of music as a formalist structure, and sort of understanding the manipulation of the different aspects of the music, but how they need to work in context, and and as a metaphor for collaboration. And I could make a big argument that all that clubbing time was time well spent, and certainly informed your creative, sort of like your writing, just as a purely as a music journalist, and then also your creativity. And I think that focus and that energy, as opposed to sort of, I'm going to walk up, knock, knock. I want to be, put me in, coach. I want to play football. It's like, you were doing backyard football, you were going and playing high school football, then you were playing college football, you were doing the reps, you're in the weight room, you're doing all the work, and it's long and difficult.
There's definitely two things I want to say to that. One is actually one story that comes to mind, because I was showing to a game designer, as in a board game designer friend of mine, and he told me this story, and it was about the head of the company and him and this other person who said, I want to do board game design.
Yep.
And they said okay, we'll get in the pub, and they met, and the person who runs the company, oh, here's a little project I'm working on, and he gets out this board game, and then the other guy, oh yeah, I'm working on this, and shows this, and these aren't work projects, these are just game design stuff. And the person who wants to get in, and so what are you working on? And he's not got anything to show. And that's the thing, is you genuinely don't need anyone else to tell you to be able to do that. Yep. As in, like, if you were like, this is what I was saying earlier, I think comics, as in, do the comics which you are possible to do in your situation. And there's the challenge there is working out what is your situation. I said, okay, what comics can I do here? Yeah, maybe I can't do the Michael Bay epic in my head. What could I do? As in, what stories can I tell? But the flip of that story, because I think we're inching dangerously close to, hard work pays off. The flip of it is, I know so many people who worked just as hard as I did and got nowhere.
Yes.
The awful truth for this sort of creative industry is there are many other factors, and also the lottery ticket of it.
Absolutely,
it's still a lottery ticket, and it's the I must admit, I occasionally get survivor's guilt in some ways, in terms of like coming, in that scene when I got into comics, and like all the people who came up to them, and some people have gone to the industry, some people who didn't, some people who worked out for different reasons or not. Right. Like, I definitely kind of think about, I am hyper aware of, like, I've put the work in, definitely, but I'm also aware I'm lucky, and those two things are both true.
Well, and I absolutely, I would put the question to you of, I'm not sure I've seen people get lucky who didn't do the work.
Yes, or they get lucky briefly and then they're out.
Yeah, right. They don't. Yeah, they don't stick. And I think that the rigor of the approach and having done the work, of course, you need the talent, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's another component that we haven't talked about, because there's a lot of people that do the work that don't necessarily have the talent, and they get the opportunity and things don't work out. And so that's difficult because that's ineffable and very hard to quantify. But absolutely, you know, going back to the club where you get offered to write for Amiga Power, it's like the kismet of being in the right place at the right time, where the DJ walks over to you and says, "Hey, kid, we got an opening," and suddenly I turned into some sort of New Yorker 1930s character. "Hey, kid, we got a space," which is, you know, I'm a Texan, so that's not my first inclination. But that, you know, so I think that's critical. Okay, so I just can't get. Yeah, please go ahead.
The one sentence where it says the work buys you the ticket, like, you know, that's the thing. It's like, you've got to do the work to get a ticket, but the ticket may not pay off. That's the kind of the way I tend to think about these things.
That's a great way to put it. So, all right. So now you're taking pictures. You know, the other thing I want to point out is sort of like, I think this is hugely important for creative people, which is, I think early in your creative journey, no matter who you are, a writer or an artist, is you look at the limitations and you yell at the limitations. You know, it's like, I've got 8 pages, I wanted 15, you know, fill in the blank to be able to do my creatively express myself. But I think a real key for creative people to understand is, if you can flip that thinking, and of course it's not always true, but if you can flip that thinking and look at the limitations as the virtue, I think great things can be unlocked. And that's really what you're talking about, is you're saying, what can I do with what I have? And you're going out and taking these pictures, and it's through the club life of like, that's another thing of like, you're going out to have fun and socialize with your friends, but you're going to repurpose that as work. And I think being proactive and in a place where you can say, here are my limitations, but I'm going to make my limitations the virtue, and to be able to take that work and use it as a creative workshop to get better at your craft. I think that's huge.
I agree. And like, you know, my comics are always the most experimental when I've clearly realized I have an extra 8 pages of content I've got to fit in. You know what I mean? Like, if I've planned it right, it's fine. But it's like, oh, now I've got to be clever. Shit. But no, it's like, and that is the challenge. And like, I mean, like, I've written specs. I've written a spec script and stuff and all that kind of thing. And like, comics are such a demanding. At least the way I write full scripts. Okay, not always full script, but like almost always full script. Because I like the poetry of comics. I like the problem solving. I like worrying about who's standing on the left. Because you know, those kind of, the sort of thinking you've got to do for a comics page is significant. And that's what I like. I like the sheer brutal. That was always, as when I was starting off, the sheer brutal challenge of it. You know, you know, and it all comes back to the formalism aspect in terms of like, okay, I mean, of course, I just did want to write comics, and like, this is the reason why I haven't written a novel properly. Like, it's always okay. It's got to be a novel for a reason, because I'm somebody who like thinks about form at the same time I think about the content. So it's like, kind of like, if I'm thinking about comic, it's not just a story I've chosen to do in a comic, it's a comic story. And like, it's like, actually, I'm doing lots of game design as well now. And it's always okay, why is this a game? You know, these are
really important.
That's very much how my brain works. But back to the indie scene. So I'm doing Negative Land. Like, I'm publishing anthologies. I'm contributing to anthologies.
Wow.
Like me and actually me and Alex DeCampi did one, which is amazing to think of.
Wow.
And we were, and you in the scene. This is the scene I came in via the web forums, but like, obviously it becomes a real world scene, and this is so important for a creator in terms of finding people who are like you. And this is like Jamie. This is where the me and Jamie happens in. We think it's 2003. It might be 2002. Bristol Comic Con. I'm sharing a table with somebody else. Not Al Ewing. I forgot his name. Another British comic creator who has only ever been in the small press. Lovely guy. Alistair Stewart. No, that's a different one. I've got all my Alistairs. I'm so sorry, Alistairs. Jamie's done a story in this anthology, this other anthology I'm sharing a table with. I'm selling my first hit anthology. Jamie comes up to the table with his portfolio, and he's trying to find the other Al. He's not there. He says, can I show you the portfolio? He shows the portfolio, and instantly I see he's been reading all the only comics I've been reading. You know,
Wow.
this is very clearly there's a lot of China Clugston, there's a lot of Andy Watson here. You know,
I'll
like
tell you, China is one of the most influential creators of the past 30 years. I can swing a dead cat at Boom and hit someone editorially who was influenced by China. Like I just think that she needs to be held up on a pedestal. Like she's so gigantic. She, she's like the Velvet Underground of
no,
comics.
I said I told her you're the Stone Roses to 90.
Yeah, yeah.
As to Britpop, you are the Stone Roses of that.
What did she say?
Oh no, I don't want to. I can't say what she said. Ask me afterwards. Do ask me afterwards. It was very honestly because we pitched Phonogram as Blue Monday meets Hellblazer.
Wow.
And O'Malley.
That's amazing.
Yeah, O'Malley pitched Scott Pilgrim as Blue Monday meets Dragon Ball Z.
Wow, that's totally what that is. That's amazing.
Yeah. Wow. So like honestly, she's so influential. And of course, when I came to comics and discovered her, it was like, oh, obviously she writes about music and youth culture and lots of stuff like that. And me and Jamie immediately clearly, comics can be for like our stuff. You know what I mean? Like it's absolutely like that. I mean, she crashed in I remember like, it must have been 2005, she crashed in my living room when she did a Bristol con. And I was like, it was like, you mentioned the Velvet Underground. It was like the Velvet Underground crashing in my house. I was very much like, China Christensen. Anyway.
Incredible.
I've got distracted there about all. Oh yeah, Jamie came up, showed his work. And it was, apparently the first thing I said to him, I've got an idea for a book called Phonogram, you'll be the perfect guy to draw it.
Wow.
And that was like literally the third sentence I said to him. And this is kind of the it's all the kismet, but kismet gets a lot easier. Like if you're in a scene, like kind of like because the people in scenes, they sort of say, oh, this person's doing something a bit like me, or not like me, and you sort of move around and you end up finding allies or enemies, and enemies are as good as allies in some ways, and that's okay because like you're all shaking down. Okay, what do we want to do? And and of course, finding your people is so important, and that of course. Me running when we were running the anthologies, that was quite an aggressive way of finding people because you talk to lots of people like that.
Well, let's spend just 30 seconds on that because I mean I just want to articulate that as a tool where it's like if you're having a hard time finding people, go start an anthology and people submit to you and then you can find people. Now the problem is you got to publish the anthology.
Yeah,
but it's a good tool.
And involves such we cost. That's what I say. I definitely spent money. If you haven't lost money making comics, you haven't made comics, I think. But like, there was definitely some money spent. Well, one print upped its price at the last minute. And it was like, I still got copies of that book somewhere.
Oh man, you and I sometimes should kill some beer comparing scars.
Yeah.
It's
fun, and it was all about the scene. And Jamie, and then this of course led to. I think we were about to pitch to Oni with Phonogram. So me and Jamie this is a few years after, like 2003, we'd actually done our first comics together for an official PlayStation magazine. We did their monthly comic for like 5 years almost.
Wow.
I think we had 4 years it would have been, because it was like we got to issue 49 when they cancelled us. We wanted to quit at 50.
Well, now you've really done comics when they pull the rug out from underneath you like that.
Yeah. It wasn't like, and it was fun because obviously it got Jamie £100 a month, like in a period when he really wanted 100, he needed £100 a month. And also like he had to draw all manner of stuff he'd never drawn before. And it was fun, was it fun? I remember actually one time it was all video game jokes. And one month we did the previous month's trip with a load of Christmas hats on and stuff. And just edited them over, and it's because it was basically the Christmas update. In other words, that video game when video games update in shitty ways.
Right.
That was an easy $100. Anyway, a few years we eventually got around to pitching for it. We were going to pitch it at Oni because obviously Blue Monday, etc. And I was chatting, and this is one of the things like you're on the scene, you talk to people, you're on forums, and I think I was chatting to Laura McCubbin. Who was the art editor then at Image, and I just showed her like the pitch page Jamie just drew, and it was very much like, "Why the hell aren't you pitching it at us?"
Wow!
And then we went, "Yeah, we will." And so we did, and of course Jamie had just done the previous year an actual a comic with Eric Stevenson.
Wow.
It was
which let's contextualize for those that don't know. Eric Stevenson at this point is second in command at Image. He goes on to become first in command and a partner ultimately, and is one of the most powerful, influential figures in comics of the past 30 years. I think, I could go on and on and on about what a talent Eric is. Talent's incredible. Eric is absolutely gigantic, seismic, industry-changing figure, brilliant dude.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm sorry. So just worked with Eric.
Yeah, he just done
huge.
oh god, it was I forgot the name of the book. Literally, this is late in the day on Friday. I apologize. It's
No
basically
worries.
it's a mod love story set in San Francisco. So Jamie was like a known quantity. We pitched, and I'm pretty sure we said yes, primarily because of Jamie. But I said we've been looking. Eric, of course, is also an Anglophile, so he's very into British music. So that was a quite lucky angle for us. And he said yes. And I think we got the mail back saying, I think I was in Australia, I think, when we got the confirmation back mail.
You weren't doing science in Australia, were you?
No, I was it was the year I was taken over, because I mentioned the manifesto earlier. After the manifesto, I was invited to this conference in Australia to be like one of the keynote speakers. So they flew me down there, and I stayed for like an extra week. And I was in this internet cafe, and I got the mail back from something, and I had to turn to the person sitting next to me and tell them about the fact that I might have just got the greenlit book.
That's awesome. And did they have any idea what you were talking about?
Absolutely not. But they did say cool. They said, "Oh, that's cool for you." They sensed my enthusiasm. That's
great. So that's huge. I mean, Phonogram is such a gigantic breakthrough and such a big moment. And the why don't you kind of go through some of that sort of experience of, when do you know it's working, when do you fear it's not, sort of right, the roller coaster, because I think something else to discuss is, all this stuff is just a series of hills or mountains that you're climbing, right? And so everyone always kind of thinks that you get to this moment and then it's just cake from there. And, sort of the goals change, right? The first goal is, I know for me as a publisher, my first goal is I need to publish a comic. And then there's sort of like the good news, bad news, like, here's the good news, you published a comic. Here's the bad news, you published a comic. Now go publish another. And you're just like overwhelmed about, I now have to go do this again. Oh my God, I have to build a company. Now I have to do 2 a month. Now I have to, it's just these series of mountains you're climbing, right? So, what is it like with Phonogram?
It was a bit like Phonogram was like, obviously we pushed it hard, like, and it did, for a black and white indie book about Britpop, it did pretty well. You know what I mean? Like, But sometimes, like, the way it didn't do enormously well. In other words, like, I got money from issue 3, I think. Just the way me and Jamie gets all the money up to a certain point because he needs to, it's like the way I tend to run my own books when I'm running it completely is that the artist gets paid first, always. Like, there's a big slot, and then we start looking at money elsewhere. And I think, so
you're, to just break it down for the folks that are breaking in, it's like, so you're basically writing for free until you hit a certain point at which your artist is covered, and then you're coming in and taking a paycheck.
Exactly. Like, especially like that seemed to be the fair way of doing it. I mean, Jamie, a lot of people don't split it 50-50 between writer and artist, which is completely understandable and different. Jamie insists on that because, especially with Phonogram, I was doing a lot of extra work anyway. And also he gets paid first was always kind of like, listen, he could abstractly make rent. Not very, and by the, okay, there's a question. So we did it, we got through it. It reviewed well-ish. It was very clearly an abrasive book. It was written to be abrasive. It was kind of like, I was explicitly conceptualizing Phonogram as, if I only get to do one book in my life, this is it. Like,
but that's how great stuff's done.
I hope so. Yeah.
But I think that's important. Is like, you need to recognize commercial parameters. And I think one of the great things about Image is that it affords you tremendous creativity, but at the same time, there is a framework of a commercial expression. It's a $2.99. It's a black and white comic. It's not a color comic. It's a stapled, sort of saddle stitched is the industry term for those that don't know it. But it's sort of like I think it was $2.99, right? Sort of like
I forget. I think it might be 350 actually.
Well, there you go. Smart. So
Yeah.
within that context, it affords you this framework that you didn't have when you were doing zines, right? So
Yeah.
you have a lane to operate in and a structure that Image is providing, but at the same time, it gives you that freedom and that creativity. And I think that's very potent.
Yeah, and it got a lot. Interest. It was like it's carried on selling forever. It's done pretty like it's not Wictive, but it's done like it was a cult book. It got very devoted fans. We got like people with tattoos quite quickly, and we were like, it's funny because it is a strange one. I've got like, especially like people older than me, like pros already in the industry, talk about how they felt about Phonogram when they saw it. In terms, we talked about voice earlier. The idea, oh yeah, here's clearly a book that has something to say in itself, but at the same time, the people who didn't like us, which is completely fair, I was aware that we often got the idea that we're trying to be too cool, which is like it's like tough. And that was kind of about me failing to express what the book was doing, and we did that with the second volume. Like a lot of the what people were missing made me go, okay, let's go back to first principles, and we'll walk this through what I'm actually, because it's a book about love of music, and it's all about anyone who's cool is always wrong. But the one review I always remember, like Joe McCulloch, Jog, who is an amazing critic, bless him. He's like one of the few of that generation I genuinely like. I remember him reviewing Phonogram. He says, "Oh, you can almost see the sweat," and that I kind of like the. And it was like, he absolutely nailed us. You know what I mean? Like, he was one of the few. We weren't cool. We were literally panicked and like trying really hard.
That's brilliant.
And you asked, to link back to your earlier question, like probably an hour ago now, the about trying to do as music.
Yep.
The first Phonogram, Rue Britannia, we didn't really do that. It was about the music. It was almost like the music zine. It was about the music press. It was about, we used a lot of comics techniques, but it never really ever felt like music. It felt like talking about music, but it wasn't often about it. And when we got round to, Jamie did like Suburban Glamour, then we came back in 2008 with a second volume, the Singles Club, and that was when we explicitly, okay, let's try to make it feel more like music, because Rue Britannia is like a Hellblazer story. It's that kind of like urban fantasy adventure, and Singles Club were like these short narrative stories that tie together, but they're all about, here's a single theme. And there's a lot more about, okay, how can we do the beats? Like, because I remember actually did a panel with like Kid Koala, me, Jamie, and Kid Koala, talking about how talk about music and comics and all this kind of stuff, and also John Boy, an animator, was also with us. I think it's called John Boy, and all these things are the same. It's all about top, and it's funny because we all just started math nerding, and you can imagine like all the art people in the audience were horrified, but like so much is just math. And like, because like what is a beat is math, so us sitting down and working how many panels per page, how can we create this thing? And we led to the point where the last issue in Singles Club is Wolf Like Me, which is, it's mostly silent episode, and the entire structure is based around the record Wolf Like Me by TV on the Radio. As in, we start with intro, the instruments come in one by one as we drop the background in, verse, chorus, breakdown, chorus, repeat, fade out. So like the experience of, you can't read it in time, but the flow, what we're trying to evoke is there, and that's kind of like a lot of what I like in comics is the rhythm of it. You get it in Phonogram. We like the dance. Sorry, Wictive, like the rave episode in Phonogram when you explicitly trying to keep that. And it's funny because it's like my more recent work, I've sort of stepped a bit away from it. The possible exception being the Casper, like in Once the Future, like I leave space for Dan. Like there's so much like I'm right. I like a lot of it is, a lot of the joy of Once the Future is stepping back and letting Dan let rip. It's not, this isn't the formalist book. This is a book where Dan is a rock star and like I'm being lead singer over the top of him, and there's that kind of energy. And with Die, Stephanie is like an ocean, so like it's quite caption led. So Stephanie does what Stephanie wants to do, and I sort of like navigate over it. And a lot of that comes from having done like Wictive, which was like a 50 issue series, 51 issue series, and about formalism. It's a bit like, okay, let's try different organs. The exception being, of course, the Peter Cannon book I did with Casper over at Dynamite, which is the most formalist thing I've ever done, and a lot of fun.
Wow. Okay, before we go forward, I'm compelled to share with you, are you familiar, there's an EC story, I would imagine, I was not much of an EC guy at all. I don't know if you're familiar with, 1950s publisher, that they did a story called Master Race. Are you familiar with it at all?
I'm aware of Master Race, yes.
Okay. So just for the folks that want to Google it, one thing contextually that's super important with Master Race to talk about was the understanding of what the Nazis had actually done during World War II had not hit the general public. So people didn't understand about the Holocaust yet, and it was the 1950s. And so the story is about hunting a Nazi war criminal for crimes against humanity. So the subject matter of the story, obviously the title Master Race is triggering, but that was because people did not know about these war crimes. And anyway, so the subject matter was mind-blowing and revelatory at the time. Wasn't talked about on TV, and but the formalism that's used to express the story is incredibly powerful. And so I think some of the earliest uses of panels to denote time and to break it down and use it in the ways that we're talking about with understanding comics and Watchmen. So I would really encourage writers and artists to look at Master Race. It's a short story. I think it's like 6-8 pages, and study it. It's obviously old story, so it's bound by being 70 years old. But anyway, sorry for the tangent.
No, it's same as it's like film students. You go back and study stuff, and you take it apart.
So that was amazing, Kieron Gillen. Great stuff. We're going to be putting up part 3 next week. Make sure that you check it out. Also, make sure that you hit subscribe, and make sure that you hit the notification bell so that when we upload the third part of the interview, it gives you a notification. So thank you so much for watching.